So our first speaker this afternoon is none other than Cary Nelson, who is Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences Emeritus at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and the author or editor of 36 books, among them 6 books about anti-Semitism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is a former national president of the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, and is currently chair of the Alliance for Academic Freedom. His talk is entitled, "The Future of Campus Anti-Semitism Post-October 7th." So please join me in welcoming him.
Is this on? It is. Sounds like it is. So thank you, Brett, and my thanks to you for the courage and the scholarly commitment required to plan and carry out what has, I think, for us, not just for Jews everywhere and for everyone in Israel, but now for us as well, a kind of wartime event. This is a wartime conference because we are at war in higher education. I'm going to do something that not everyone will appreciate too much. Part of my career has been involved in analyzing visual images, and so I'm going to talk about a single photograph, which is not unpleasant, it's horrific, and it will be up on the screen. I think this is a necessary part of coming to terms with the historical and political and human context of the after effects of October 7th. So I'm going to talk about October 7th first, and then segue into the current state of the university. But I do want to begin by reminding us what events actually, and very much counterintuitively, triggered the outpouring of putatively pro-Palestinian anti-Semitism we're now witnessing here and across the country, putatively. So let's. This has become an iconic photograph, an image of Hamas terrorists on October 7th, riding on the bed of a white pickup truck as it travels into Gaza from Israel, surrounding the body of a young German-Israeli woman, Shani Louk. 4 of the terrorists are on the truck bed. A 5th, as you see, is on the running board, hanging on to the metal frame above the window. For Hamas, not for us, Louk's body is a victory token, a trophy, nearly encircled by the perpetrators. The visual dynamic in front of us is, first of all, one of vertical sexual mastery, as all of the Hamas figures are positioned above her body. At the top, the Hamas figure brandishing a machine gun calls out open mouth and points downward in very dramatic, deliberate, emphatic, proud display of her body, of the trophy. To the left, the figure holding up a rocket-propelled grenade calls out still more forcefully, open-mouthed. In an added vulgarity, his right leg is draped casually over Louk's body, perhaps helping to keep it from falling out of the truck, but also in bald contempt and disrespect. Her right leg sticks out awkwardly over the edge of the truck, adding a distinctly grisly edge to the photo. The invisible photographer behind the truck actually completes the circle. The photographer is complicit and is in part the structure of encirclement includes him. It's believed he entered Israel with Hamas. He's part of the event, not a neutral witness documenting it. Are the Hamas terrorists, in fact, consciously performing for an audience, or just captured in the frenzy of their celebration? Perhaps both. Some seem very much aware of the photographer. They seem to be performing for him, and of course, for the future audience. Now, it may seem strange, even a desecration, to do this kind of close analysis of a photo like this, but from my perspective, the analysis solidifies the outrage that the photo warrants. Looking at these details make the photo worse, not easier to internalize. The Associated Press gathered a group of its Gaza war photos by different photographers. This one was a freelance photographer, including this one, and organized a group of 20 photos from Gaza retroactively as a narrative sequence and submitted it for an award. The photograph wasn't taken as part of the sequence. It didn't originate that way, and none of the other 20 photographs did either. The award, therefore, is important. It's extremely troubling, but it's incidental to the intrinsic meaning of the photograph itself. You can't fill the photograph when you think of it with the fact of the award. As two writers argue in an essay in Slate, the Associated Press was already ethically compromised by compensating a Hamas-allied photographer. It made matters worse by seeking to gain further reputational benefit from the image. They submitted it for an award, and they're seeking a benefit from this photograph. They're seeking to extract prestige from the image of this murdered woman. Now, if I click on the version of the photo in a Times of Israel story about the award that the photo received from the Donald Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism, I get a large, chilling version focused not on her body, but on the gestures and expressions of the Hamas killers. They're all positioned differently, which gives the image the character of an iconic collective portrait of that day's celebratory nightmare. It's an icon of the nightmare. Given that Shani's face is not visible, maybe it was a mistake for the Times of Israel to blur her body. You don't see the blurred version here, you see the version that is not blurred, even though I understand the impulse to protect her violated privacy. The Jewish Chronicle also blurred the photo, and some news sites refused to reproduce the photo at all, often preferring an image of her while she was still alive and vital, of which there are many family photographs. And of course, the relatives prefer the image of her living, not slaughtered. On the other hand, Haaretz, Business Insider, the New York Post reproduced the photo as you see it, unblurred. Some venues reproduce a series of recent images of her from throughout her life to establish her individuality, in contrast to AP's objectifying image. Some places produced images from her childhood days, sort of tracked her as she grew up to being an adult, but stopped short of this image. Now, the Journalism Institute gave the photo pride of place, this photo, and used it to illustrate the award. So they don't just reproduce it, they say, look especially at this one. This shows you why the Associated Press deserves its recognition. And it's not blurred on their website. It's actually Louk's father, Nissim, who's correct to say that this photo may have that iconic status for decades. Her father makes that point that it's come to represent the Hamas massacre, and it may continue to do that forever, for years. I think the other problem with the award is that it takes the photographer out of the context of complicity. I mean, for all practical purposes, he is a Hamas terrorist himself. He's not an independent figure. The caption to the photo on the award site, as a friend of mine, Marsha Cooper, suggested in a listserv discussion, makes matters worse. It reverses the time sequence and treats the Hamas assault as if it were a justified response to the IDF's subsequent air campaign. That's the caption. They don't say it explicitly, but the narration creates that effect. That's the Missouri Journalism School's way of placing the photograph historically. You wouldn't consciously believe the time sequence had been reversed. Well, some of our students might never want to put anything past them. But many would perhaps be vulnerable to the anti-Semitic demand that our response to Hamas's assault should be conditioned by the Israeli bombing campaign that followed it. That in some odd way, you should think of the assault as a kind of product of the subsequent bombing campaign, which of course occurred later, not beforehand. The logic in part that informs that particular illusion is that 20,000 dead Gaza civilians is not a proportional price to exact in punishment for 1,200 Israel dead. That despite the huge moral incommensurability and Hamas's public declaration that it wants to repeat the assault again and again over time if it can get away with it. The Missouri caption begins by reporting that the militant Hamas rulers of the Gaza Strip carried out an unprecedented multi-front attack on Israel at daybreak Saturday, October 7th, firing thousands of rockets as dozens of Hamas fighters infiltrated the border by air, land, and sea. But then it proceeds to report that Israel's retaliation after Gaza's militant Hamas rulers launched the unprecedented attack and took captives dozens of people, scores of people. Heavy Israeli airstrikes on the enclave killed thousands of Palestinians. Only then does the caption address the photo itself. That's why it has this effect of historical reversal. They don't mention the award or mention the photo until they finish taking you through the sequence of events that followed it. There was, of course, no context of mass civilian deaths behind Louk's murder. It could hardly be a retaliation for later events. There are other iconic wartime photos you can compare this with. Among them, Nick Ute's 1972 photo of the Vietnamese child Kim Phuc fleeing naked down a road with members of her family after a napalm attack. I don't put the other photos up because I'm assuming they're all pretty familiar. That image helped solidify opposition to the war. One may also recall the February 23, 1945 photo by Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press of 6 United States Marines raising the U.S. flag atop Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima in the final months of the Pacific War. Of course, unlike the Hamas photo, no one celebrated the near incineration of the child Kim. And in the Iwo Jima photo, the flag is lifted above the soldiers, not trampled beneath their feet. And finally, one adds the July 1993 photo by the Toronto Star's Paul Watson, showing Somali warlord Mohammed Aidid's supporters dragging the body of U.S. Staff Sergeant William David Cleveland through the streets of Mogadishu. The graphic total nakedness of his body, supplemented by a video in which a crowd cheers, actually helped to bring an end to U.S. involvement. Taken in the days long before social media, Watson's photo could not gain distribution to a broad audience of enthusiastic murderers. The photo of Shani Louk's body, celebrated and desecrated, was a dual-use image from the outset. As soon as it appeared online, it would gratify some Gazans and horrify Israelis. In the end, it's obviously not just one 23-year-old woman in the truck. As Hamas and the photographer well understood, Israel herself is on display in the body of that truck bed. Israel defeated, humiliated, and degraded. The grief we feel is riven by a kind of shame that we, the Jews of the world, let it happen, that we were blind to the forces arrayed against us and powerless to intervene. Moreover, given the now reconfirmed status of the Hamas charter, we know that the group and its allies want our bodies on that truck as well. We are all supposed to be there on that truck. And some, in the university encampments across the U.S. share the same sentiment. They want us dead on that truck bed. We can set aside any doubt about Gazan and international anti-Zionist willingness to celebrate the image taken by the Hamas AP freelance journalist, in quotes, Ali Mahmoud, accompanying the attack. The key question for Western academics remains: how many of our anti-Zionist colleagues feel just the same? How many are motivated to applaud the photo as documenting a, quote, legitimate act of resistance? I'm going to explore the implications of that, the answer to that question being an affirmative answer that many share that sentiment. I guess my guess would be a few people who registered for the conference today share that sentiment. Don't know whether any of them showed up, but that's my guess, that if I were in their position, I would have wanted to know what was happening here, and I would have registered for the conference. So how you respond to this image depends, almost incomprehensibly, on whether you see it as embodying warranted exultation or as documenting reprehensible contempt. And in that dichotomy, you can recognize our current campus polarization. In the dichotomous responses to the photo, you replicate the psychological and political reality of this campus and others. As my friend suggested, in both the Gaza and the Iwo Jima images, the photographer is celebratory, despite their hugely contrasting moral conses. But the Vietnam photo seeks empathy from the viewer. The Hamas photography seeks no empathy for the victim. The New York Post uses a Mahmoud photo of her body on the truck, but taken from the side rather than the rear, establishing that the photographer submitted more than one image of this to the Associated Press. How many he submitted, we don't know. Did the truck pause long enough for him to record the incident from multiple vantage points? A Hamas video circulated showing the terrorists with the truck parading her body through cheering crowds in Gaza. Faced with an anti-Semitic rupture in our assumptions about Israeli security and the reliability of Israeli intelligence estimates, our sense of the probable limits of unchecked human violence, the status of Jews in the diaspora, and of the depth of incipient anti-Semitism hiding in our own backyards. All of those things are at stake. We misread our own political reality in the United States. We didn't understand the depth of anti-Semitism brewing in our campuses, but you cannot account for the sudden support of Hamas seen from many audiences in the West unless that powerful anti-Semitism was already percolating beneath the surface. It's not uncommon to encounter Jews still trying to test now their confidence in prognostication. Quote, "This too shall pass." Some of your friends may have told, "This too shall pass." We'll soon return to a normal level of hatred and malice, just the regular hatred and malice, nothing to get fussy about. Of course, normality in the U.S. was already categorically disrupted by the Pittsburgh and Poway murders. Expectations were already on edge, poised for something equivalent or worse. Meanwhile, heightened anxiety has to be grounded in impossible knowledge. Hamas's conduct on 10/7 was fundamentally impossible to understand. The intricate, obscene, intimate brutality sustained for hours cannot really be registered in detail. You can't really make sense of the human motivations behind it. It resembles something like an endless horror movie more than a sequence of believable crimes. So some retreat into denial or into non-recognition, because in a way none of us can remain face to face with the carnage of that day. You cannot sustain that perspective. And yet, I think we must try, because the intolerable facts of the massacre are now compounded by the determination of Hamas apologists on this campus and elsewhere to deny the reality of this took place. Our courageous Hamas warriors would not have assaulted women. We respect women. We hold them in the highest regard. It's simply impossible that our men did that. The photographic evidence in the case of that disbelief, that self-denial, doesn't matter. I feel a moral responsibility to approximate at least a glimpse of some of what the victims experienced, although it's again impossible. Fear for themselves, fear for their family members, struggle, efforts at self-defense, surprise and shock, anger, excruciating pain, disbelief, often intermixed, all of those things place the events of 10/7 outside comprehension. And these descriptive categories that I've just offered are themselves too familiar, too cliched to be adequate. Nor are the range of personal experiences are not interchangeable. A Jewish family under attack in its safe room, 20 Israelis crowded into a roadside shelter, a lightly armed kibbutz defender trying to block access by a murder squad about to be overwhelmed, a child trying to process a nightmare that's become real, concert goers gunned down in their cars, IDF soldiers unexpectedly under attack by a superior force, a woman in a field undergoing the most primal sexual assault imaginable. These experiences are at once singular and unique, and yet collectively identified as the figure of 10/7. We are revolted to realize that some in Gaza, some on the West Bank, and throughout the West, not only approve of the Hamas assault, but are determined to glory in its particulars. The relentlessly anti-Semitic former George Washington University psychologist Lara Sheeha, now a faculty member in Qatar, declared that we must abandon our romantic illusions about revolutionary resistance. In an October 27 statement, Sheehy responded to Hamas's October assault by declaring, quote, "We have to rid ourselves of our romantic notions of what uprisings look like," end quote. We need to interrogate her remark by asking what it actually means. Hamas's contempt for its victims is matched by Sheeha's contempt for those who do not agree with her about the necessity for radical violence as the only authentic form of resistance to settler colonialism. She regularly invokes Frantz Fanon. Of course, there are alternatives. There are violent uprisings quite short of the gleeful butchery of October 7, and there are revolutions carried out substantially with nonviolent resistance. For Sheeha, 10/7 shows us what true revolutionary resistance must entail. She finds everything Hamas did on that day necessary and instructive, everything essential to the project of liberation. There's no excess to condemn on 10/7, no violation of the norms that should govern revolutionary conduct. It was all just as it should be, just as it should be. Shame on us if we falter or show weakness in our resolve to embrace the events of the day. And the effect, therefore, is not only to justify infinite varieties of violence against Israelis, but also an extraordinary escalation of terrorist violence overall. Once you endorse what Hamas did, you endorse it happening across the globe. October 7 is apparently an experience its fans may well choose to relive, to savor, as they rerun the newsreels in their heads. Some of those in this anti-Zionist chorus of ghouls include colleagues on my own campus, here and throughout the country. Students for Justice in Palestine has stepped up to give organizational form to murderous ecstasy. And a new group, Faculty for Justice in Palestine, FJP, has paired with SJP to assure ecstatic faculty fans of murder and rape a supportive community and a collective voice. The local FJP manifesto is the most virulently anti-Semitic one in the country. The one coming out of this campus, I believe, is the single worst, most anti-Semitic of the 100 or so that exist in the U.S. Will they stand down anytime soon? Will they moderate their enthusiasm for Hamas? Will they allow any of us to mourn our dead, unsettled by continuing hate? When the war ends and the size of frequency of anti-Israel demonstrations will diminish, but I don't think the hostility toward Israel or the organized commitment to eliminate the Jewish state are going to pass. It may persist at a level we have not seen in the wake of previous wars with Hamas. How the war will be seen 5 or 10 years later will depend largely on whether it makes space for a better political and economic future for Gaza. Something, although many Americans can't accept it, which now requires the elimination of Hamas as a functioning political and military force. Gazans have had no viable political present. They've had no viable political future, and they can't get one while Hamas still is in control. They can't have any kind of freedom until Hamas is off their backs. Those who see this as their defining political cause, as central to their identity, are not going to give it up. Christianity historically defined itself in opposition to Judaism. So too does the international left increasingly substitute opposition to Israel for its traditional affirmative commitments. In other words, historically, Christianity constituted its set of beliefs in opposition to the Jewish other. And now the international left, which I still like to think myself as some sort of member of, defines itself in opposition to Israel. There is an alternative. One can maintain the commitments to egalitarianism and to fighting injustice without collapsing all the forces combating these goals into a single demonized and imaginary Jewish entity. For Christianity, Judaism was everything aligned against a merciful and loving God. Now for the anti-Zionist left, it's the Jewish state standing in the way of worldwide liberation, an absurdity. In the destructive dynamic that ensues, aggression against the imaginary opponent substitutes for the need to work toward realization of the group's supposedly affirmative goals. You stop working for positive change, you devote all of your identity into hostility. So the group is defined by simplistically declaring what it is not. We are not Israel. That's your self-definition. And the actual impediments to justice are ignored. Now, these are only highlights of escalating campus anti-Zionism. It would take a lot more to document it. But once a new tactic enters the repertoire of campus anti-Zionism, as we've seen in the last weeks with these occupations, it becomes part of the established norm for protest and hostile action. Once department statements against Israel were issued for the first time in 2021, they began to drive department practices, while also laying in wait for expanded use when the occasion arose. At Illinois, departments have been hiring on the basis of anti-Zionism. There are a lot of young faculty here who were brought on board in part because anti-Zionism is part of their belief set. If anything, that will increase. Predictably, we saw many more departmental statements in 23 and 24, with more departments and more disciplines joining in. Anti-Zionist rhetoric and accusation can take a different route, spreading gradually over a period of years, then exploding in use in response to new circumstances. Accusations of Israeli apartheid increased gradually over many years until they received a boost from 2021 and 22 reports by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Appearing in the wake of the 2021 war with Gaza, these reports helped fuel a decisive normalization of the apartheid accusation. Despite the fact that Palestinians serve as lawmakers in the Israeli parliament, as judges, doctors, and teachers, and serving as well in the IDF. And of course, as you will learn today, if you didn't already know, the Druze serve in the IDF as well. Accusations of Israeli genocide against Palestinians became gradually more common until they became omnipresent in response to Hamas's flawed casualty numbers this year and the last. So I've found that each war with Hamas establishes a new, more aggressive floor for campus anti-Zionism. The minimum accepted level goes up. It's gone up each time. It's going to go up again this time. It already has. This too shall pass. I wish it would. I don't think it will. The aggressive mass disruption of the Zionist events has now become normalized. Participants are more willing to abridge academic freedom. Small-scale violence and the threat of something more have increased. On many campuses, administrative cowardice means that sanctions for such actions remain out of reach. Columbia University banned Students for Justice in Palestine, then turned the other way when the group continued to organize illegal demonstrations. We've banned them. They just kept doing what they wanted to do. No action. Administrators like to take strong moral and political stands, as they did throughout the country with the George Floyd murder, when everyone agrees with them. Not so much when campus opinion is polarized and responsible action requires courage and will come with political conflict and a personal price. So, lots of support for George Floyd, not so much for Israel. It had seemed likely that Columbia would do little or nothing to protect Jewish students and faculty, but at least they took the step, and some other schools did, of suspending students who had taken major roles in carrying out disruptive actions that violated university policy. You can stand outside a building and protest, but you can't block access to the building, you can't block approved speakers or scheduled classes, and you can't break windows and doors and enter a building. They'll take action when that line is crossed, but not for anti-Semitism. Notable and unpredictable events in the current war, and we'll see more, will trigger local and national reactions. That I expect to include additional national disciplinary groups entering the fray, those that had avoided it so far. We'll almost see motions defeated or approved in faculty organizations with small margins. This happened with anthropology, barely defeating a boycott vote in 2017. Then in 2023, the anthropology vote was overwhelming and it swept aside the opposition. These political transformations ripple through teaching, recruitment, and personnel decisions in the relevant disciplines. Once you make a formal department commitment to anti-Zionism, then you start asking, now what should we do with anti-Zionism when we recruit students? What should we do with anti-Zionism when we evaluate faculty research proposals, when we hire new people, when we face tenure decisions? Those departmental statements are agenda for all of the decisions the department is going to make about its present and future members. Increasingly, acrimonious local debates have been common for a decade. But by 2018, they took a newly poisonous form, including here, turning into Palestinian versus Jewish competitions for premier victimhood status. I've spoken at numerous student government debates about divestment resolutions here, and in 2018, I couldn't do any good because issues about the Middle East, issues about historical fact, no one was talking about them. The students weren't interested in them. neither on the Jewish or on the pro-Palestinian side. They were interested in proving that they suffered more. That is not a good basis for doing historical analysis and comparison. That is not. You can't think about Israel in terms purely of your personal life, or think about it. It doesn't work that way. So they compete for sympathy and membership in the most aggrieved group status. So that stuff doesn't lead to reasoned debate, and it's going to get worse. And it intensifies intergroup hatred. If you're trying to compete for victimhood status, you tend much more to hate your opponents. As hatred replaces politics at center stage, we enter a new intensified phase of campus conflict. It's grounded in the recognized psychology of othering and casting out of an enemy group. Rather than trying to win a debate, you struggle for this form of power over the other. And the floor character of anti-Zionism then becomes primarily emotional. That hardly serves as a model for a university education. So I don't see campus hatred for Israel dissipating. It's fundamental to a world in which anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism has substantially merged. Post 10/7, hatred for Israel no longer has to be justified or rationalized. The belief that all Jews are complicit in Israel's purported crimes is now commonplace in anti-Zionist advocacy. Jews who want to fit in with progressive groups are required to condemn their own national heritage and their millennial ancestral ties to Israel, to condemn part of themselves. You have to embrace partial self-hatred as the entry card to campus progressive groups. And as I said, all of this hatred was lying in reserve, and you can't account for developments without that. Hatred for victims of merciless, inhumane violence was hardly to be expected, and yet that's what we got. For the campus left, I think, that reaction, that unpredictable anger at Israel's own subjection to murderous violence, it may have been facilitated by outrage that the Israelis, the left's official oppressor group, were suddenly positioned as victims. It could not be accepted that Israelis were victims. Pure hatred helps deny that transformation. So the October pogrom was a personal affront for some on the left. It falsified Israelis, turning them into something anti-Zionists know that they're not, victims. Just as we did not imagine Hamas to be militarily capable of organizing and carrying out the October assault, or perhaps even of harboring sufficient hatred to fuel face-to-face intimate butchery and rape, we did not understand the passions latent in our on-campus communities. Now that it's found expression, it's going to be here to stay. So that means that faculty, students, and staff whose affinity for Israel shapes their own identities are going to face increased pressure to disavow that relationship, breaking with their own inner lives. Most undergraduate students are at a vulnerable age where they're in the process of identity formation and consolidation. Zionist students in anti-Semitic campus settings will suffer assaults on their emerging identities. Indeed, with identity politics now dominating many of the campus disputes, as I said, we need to realize that assaulting Jewish student identities during their vulnerable, impressionable years is a primary goal for Israel's opponents. In other words, disagreements over Israeli policy, castigations of Israel, serve as attacks on the identities of the people in the room, and they're deployed with that in mind. It's a smokescreen for those personal psychological assaults. Now, there are students in programs with majority Zionist faculty and student membership who will be able to withstand these psychological assaults, but many others will find the level of psychological safety necessary to do their work difficult to sustain. Universities are not in the business of providing intellectual safety. Intellectual challenges are essential to education, and those intellectual challenges are protected by academic freedom. But a sense of psychological safety is necessary if students are to believe they can express their views and debate the strengths and weaknesses of those views without being personally denounced or personally discriminated against. There's a great deal of research about the importance of psychological safety, but many faculty members are unfamiliar with the concept and they willfully ignore the distinction between psychological safety and intellectual safety, accepting the former, objecting to the latter. The new campus hatred persuades students and faculty that discrimination against Zionists is morally virtuous. That sentiment has been in limited evidence for several years. I think it will now escalate and become majority motivation. Campuses and their administrators need not persist in supposing these are merely political conflicts, nor can they persist in believing that reasoned debates and civil discussion alone can address growing campus anti-Semitism. Broad and required education about anti-Semitism is essential. It's nonsense if you see an anti-Zionist event and say you arrange a speaker 3 weeks later who comes from a Zionist perspective. You cannot compensate for hatred that way. You couldn't compensate for racist hatred that way. Its effects are long and deep, and you can't compensate for anti-Zionism that way. You have to take on a full-scale, long-term educational program if you want to counter the dissemination of hate on a campus. And that's a huge change. On many campuses, anything and everything done on behalf of a Jewish minority will become still more controversial and more widely opposed than in recent years. It's going to take organized faculty advocacy and participation to make any progress possible. Administrators will require courage to improve the campus climate by putting better policies in place and even more to enforce those policies. I'm a strong advocate of adopting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, but the fact is many campuses that have adopted it haven't done a damn thing with it. They put it on the books and then they ignore it. So it ain't going to do any good just as a kind of tablet somewhere in the administration building. And the worst thing we face on campus is these corrosive, blatantly anti-Semitic academic departments that declare themselves officially opposed to Zionism. We have several of those departments on this campus, departments that are lost to human reason, departments that cannot heal themselves, departments that cannot repair themselves. AAUP policy for decades, and hell, I believed it, was that disciplines go off the rails and then they come to their senses and they fix themselves. Do you really think the departments on this campus that have thoroughly embraced anti-Zionism are going to suddenly come to their senses? Well, I've got some swampland in Florida to sell you if you want to go that route. They're not going to fix themselves. Some of those departments are widely considered by other departments throughout the country and on this campus as ludicrous. They're considered jokes, not serious intellectual academic enterprises. Do you think that the chemistry department here, its faculty members, regard the departments that adopt these political statements and hire on that basis are shining examples of academic freedom and the application of intelligence? No, they think they're fake departments, and yet we do nothing about it. That's going to be the hardest thing to face, but I don't think there's any choice about it. The faculty collectively have to engage in the evaluation of representatives of disciplines that are hopelessly lost to interest in facts and to human reason. I suspect this goes on, but I have a feeling I might have about run out of my time. Is that right? Anybody watching? Pardon? Oh, sorry? Oh, okay. Well, I'll always take them. So Interestingly, the UIUC Academic Senate drafted what is a pretty well-reasoned policy detailing why departmental statements on controversial political topics are ill-advised and likely to do harm. That's our Senate. It listed all the reasons why they're a bad idea. They said it's going to be coercive to graduate students, to undergraduates, and to untenured faculty. They're going to think they should keep their mouths shut if they disagree. It does a good job of listing all the reasons why they're going to do harm. They're trying to discourage departmental political statements. And for all the effect the statement had, they might as well have written it in the language of a galaxy far, far away. Do you think that any of these departments, convulsed by their moral certainty, were going to say, well, maybe this statement is a bad idea after all? Of course, not one of them did. They all passed the statements. And the policy drafted by the Senate, it's well worded, it's well reasoned, it was done thoughtfully, and it had absolutely no effect on the departments in the grip of a political passion. They didn't want to actually prohibit what they thought was departmental political freedom, but it ain't that. Departments don't have academic freedom. You do, but your departments don't have academic freedom in that corporate sense. They represent the institution. They are responsible to the institution. In some sense, they speak for the institution. They don't operate with the kind of freedom for good or ill that you do, but the Senate couldn't quite come to that conclusion. The departments are ready to prove that they're on the right side of history, and that's all that they're going to do. And there has to be a simple, flat prohibition against departmental statements on controversial political topics. So the compromise the Senate worked out failed completely. I do propose a policy. I have a new book out, Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, where I print what I think would be a fair policy statement, making it clear that students and faculty retain their individual rights to make political statements, that students and faculty can create ad hoc political organizations to speak for them collectively, but not administrative units of the university. You can create your own anti-Zionist organization as faculty members and students. Fine, that's part of academic freedom, but not your disciplinary institutional unit occupying that kind of space. So we have to prepare ourselves for a long-term struggle in North America and Europe generally. We can anticipate a midterm future punctuated by anti-Semitic events. In the more concentrated and semi-autonomous environments of many campuses, we can anticipate sustained and relentless anti-Semitic pressure on Jewish students and faculty, pressure that will be highlighted by notable events. I don't often get a phone call in the midst of giving a paper, but maybe that's what's here. Sorry. Well, stop. Good. So I think we have to adopt the IRA definition, and I think we have to start using it as an educational tool, not as a disciplinary guide, not as a speech code, but as a structure to organize campus debates and discussion. And in that process, the opening definition doesn't matter. The IRA definition refers to the whole thing, and it's the 11 examples that are the key and that we need to talk about. They're starting points in deciding whether something is or is not anti-Semitic. I think those are the starting point, provide some structure to what for many students seems like a formless array of anti-Semitic events that they cannot give any sense to, they can't organize, they can't conceptualize. The 11 examples give you a start in doing that. In the strongest possible terms, I urge an organized faculty effort to get the IRA definition of anti-Semitism adopted here, and I will give you warning that the campus and the university administration has made it clear they want no part of the IRA definition. They've made it clear that's where they stand, because they say their lawyers have advised against it. Well, I was president of the National AEUP for 6 years, vice president before that, and I met a lot of interesting people as a result, and that included a president of the University of Wisconsin, president of the University of Virginia, and they said that over the years they reached the conclusion that the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign receives the worst legal advice of any major university in the country. And if we had another hour, I could go through the very definitive, defining examples of that legal advice. So it doesn't fill me with confidence that our administrators asked our legal advisors what they should do. These are the same moronic legal advisors who only a few years ago told them that cars that have a political sticker on them should be prohibited from parking in university lots. Our dog, we have a dog at home, we've always had a Samoyed, so I managed to get a sticker that reads, "My Samoyed votes Democrat," and pasted it in the car and managed to get some national publicity. And eventually the university withdrew the policy that you couldn't have a political sticker on your car. They also at the same time said you couldn't attend a lecture by a political candidate on campus. That it would have been Barack Obama at the time, and if he appeared on campus to give a lecture in Follinger, students, faculty, and staff were prohibited from attending it. The advice is always the same that the outside world gives. What is it about the First Amendment that your lawyers don't understand? Well, it isn't relying on this legal advice is not a good idea. So I guess that's the last advice I'll give. Thank you very much.
Okay, Cary, thank you so much for those fantastic insights.